Okay, it's Michael Turner, professor of Russian Studies, Stetson University. It's November 25th, and this is a lecture about an hour long on Leo Tolstoy's novel, Povest, Hadji Murat. And I'm going to start this way. What I have this goal of linking Hadji Murat, the novel, to many of the concerns of war and peace, and making some of those ties which aren't always obvious, a little bit more obvious. And I'll do that after. But first, I'm going to read this paper. It's a paper I gave in August 2nd, 2025 at Cambridge. And I titled it Wu Wei in the Western Front. I guess one contextual thing that you should know is that it was delivered at a divinity conference. And so I try to make some of the parallels with contemporary religious practices more apparent. Okay, I'm going to read this. I probably won't read the whole thing, but I'm going to read some of it and then make some comments. Hadji Murat. Hadji Murat is a late work written in the 1890s and early 1900s. So Tolstoy was in his 60s and 70s, drawn from Tolstoy's memories of the 1850s Caucasus Wars. It wasn't published in his lifetime. First published in a censored edition, 1912, but they had to remove much of it for obvious reasons having to do with 1905 revolution ended some of the censorial laws by 1910, but there were still laws against depicting the Tsar and against negative depictions of the Tsar in particular, and also anything having to do with Russian Orthodoxy. And this novel, Hadji Murat, is about them both. And so the final uncensored text was published only in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. Often critics call it complete, citing the Tolstoy's diary. I'm skeptical. Tolstoy finished War and Peace and Anna Karenina many times and then kept writing. Complete for him usually meant I've set it aside. I remember 7 times in Hadji Murat in the writing of it that he said it was finished. So you can imagine, so why not an 8th time? Maybe if he lived a little bit longer. The text we now see as canonical is actually a Soviet reconstruction from the 1937 Jubilee edition of Tolstoy's work, edited under Boris Eichenbaum during the Stalinist purges. I have nothing but profound respect for the Polnaye Swaranie, the complete collected works, the Jubilee edition, which they started in 1923. But it would be foolish to pretend that there weren't some political repercussions on the editing of Hadji Murat. For decades, the novella sat at the margins of Tolstoy's studies. Then, in the 1980s, Harold Bloom famously called it the best story in the world, and it leapt into prominence, especially in the United States. In Russia, with its raw imperial critique, Hadji Murat remains less central. In the Soviet Union, it was quite popular. I saw this shift firsthand at a Tolstoy conference I hosted in Tbilisi, Georgia, in June 2023. Nearly half the papers were on Hadji Murat. What surprised me, I still remember when the story was virtually invisible. Its plot hardly seems designed for modern celebration. Let's face it, it's about an apostate Muslim who switches sides, fights for pro-imperial forces, and dies in the mud. To me, it's always been the ne plus ultra of what theologian Steve Hickey calls the second Tolstoy, the moralist, the diagnostician, the writer who turns heroic legend into forensic autopsy. And that's what I want to do here, put Hadji Murat back in the box, show how this novella, which recently vaulted into the Western canon, belongs squarely in the late Tolstoy's moral and narrative framework, not as a romantic exception, not as an escape, not as Tolstoy unable to resist writing one more good story, which is how 99% of critics and biographers depict it, but as the culmination of Tolstoy's religious thinking. Tolstoy always tells us what happens in a story, but the why isn't always readily apparent. This is the signature gesture of Tolstoy's late prose, despite what readers sometimes perceive as heavy-handedness. He strips away the mechanics of sympathy and judgment. In their place, he gives us rhythm, gesture, and structure, a spiritual autopsy. And Hadji Murat, far from being a political outlier or late life regression into realism, is one of Tolstoy's more exacting examples of this forensic form. It is not an aberration, it is utterly orthodox Tolstoy. Yet Hadji Murat is often misread, especially in the West. It's taken as a romantic throwback, a blood and soil tale of resistance. Before Tolstoy returns to sermons or parables, there is a final flash of martial virility. Readers want Hadji to be Spartacus. They want defiance, clarity, one clean death on behalf of a cause. They want him to shout, "Freedom!" at the last moment. But the text refuses this. Bluntly, Hadji dies in a ditch, his head casually, brutally hacked off and kicked into a sack by Aga Khan, his old nemesis, and carted off like a hunting trophy. Hadji never rescues his family. He initially fights for the Russians, then switches sides to fight. He originally fights against the Russians with Shamil, then switches sides to fight for the Russians before ultimately fighting against the Russians again. He participates in random acts of violence, and he is forgotten. Shamil at least gets to become a tourist attraction. Look up Shamil in Wikipedia. Tolstoy gives us no climactic arc, no catharsis. Instead, we are left with a rhythm of gradual deterioration, a ticking mechanism. Here we might invoke Gary Saul Morrison's concept of negative narration. Tolstoy does not build towards some noble culmination. We want maybe for him to rescue his family, or maybe Hadji will throw off the Russian yoke and free his people. If you've ever watched the terrible Italian Yugoslav adaptation of the novel White Warrior, this is exactly what happens in the movie. Instead, Tolstoy builds forward toward non-events, like the tragically pointless one-sided gunfight in the mud at the end of the novella. The system we are meant to understand tolerates those who yield while discarding those who don't. The story is not about action, it is about arrangement, about the picking of flowers. The story opens not with Hadji, but with the flower. The narrator walks through a summer field collecting soft, obedient blossoms for a bouquet. Tolstoy, or a narrator who seems to be Tolstoy, sees a thistle, a tatarin, which means Tatar, in the local dialect, a wild, spiny plant in full bloom. Remember, thistles, you just have to imagine an artichoke is a kind of thistle. They bloom, they're actually quite beautiful, but they're large and spiny. If you've ever peeled an artichoke, you know this is true. Anyway, the narrator climbs down into the ditch to harvest the beautiful blue flower. Here's a quote. "It was very difficult, so terribly strong that I struggled with it for 5 minutes. When I finally tore it up, the stem was in tatters and the flower no longer seemed fresh or beautiful because of its roughness and garishness." I like that word in Russian. Aryapavatosti, which means someone who says things, ляпус, means to say something out of turn, to blurt something out. And so the flower just didn't play well with others. It did not fit among the tender flowers of the bouquet. That's the end of the quote. Nothing noble or romantic here. The thistle is coarse, ugly, unworthy of the bouquet's delicate blossoms. This is the whole novel in miniature. The bouquet is the state, the arrangement of the bouquet, the aesthetic of submission by the wildflowers. The thistle, like Hadji, resists incorporation. The narrator rejects it precisely because of its ayapavatas, its coarseness, ugliness. And, and what this means is that it must be destroyed. There's another icon. Early in the novella, Prince Vorontsov, who's a historical character, famous Russian military figure in the Caucasus, gives Hadji a gift, a fine watch. This happens about page 33. This moment, often overlooked, is crucial. Hadji immediately winds the watch and listens to it tick. It's presented as a moment of fascination, but also of synchronization. The gift is not a symbol of respect, it is a mechanism. He thinks he's being honored. In fact, he's being absorbed, synchronized with the imperial order. The ticking is not only a metaphor for autonomy, but for inevitability. From this moment on, Hadji's arc becomes mechanical, like that watch. He is processed, maneuvered, flattened, readied for destruction. Tick, tick, tick. The ticking of the watch is the ticking of the plot. Tolstoy's late works are structured not around plot, but around inquest. Each begins with or near a death, not just physical death, but what we might call moral finalization. In the death of Ivan Ilyich, the story opens famously with a corpse and unfolds in reverse. We do not watch Ivan die. We watch him realize that he was already dead long before his body failed him. And this is a quote from Ivan Ilyich, Death of Ivan Ilyich. And if that's true, Ivan Ilyich said to himself, and I am leaving life with the awareness that I have ruined everything that was given to me and that it cannot be undone, then what? In these reflections, he saw himself, everything he had lived by, and he saw clearly that none of it was real and that it had all been a horrible, enormous lie, hiding both life and death. Ivan Ilyich's whole life has been a walking spiritual death, and then he dies. So we have spiritual death and then a physical death, and neither is painless. Likewise, the Kreutzer Sonata begins with a corpse, Madame Poznichova's. Monsieur Poznichov confesses to her murder, and his long-winded, tea-fueled confession charts his spiritual death. So we have a dead body and a walking corpse. In any case, in much of Tolstoy's late fiction, we encounter a pattern. The spiritual death occurs when the character accepts falsehood as truth, typically manifested in the form of career, vanity, violence, or control. The physical death, so, right, there are always two deaths, a spiritual or moral death and a physical death in Tolstoy's late stories. The physical death, anticlimactic, confirming what the soul already knew. Hadji Murat follows this structure exactly. His true death comes not at the hands of Russian soldiers, but the moment he believes his resistance will save him. He imagines himself the subject of history. This should sound like Pierre and Napoleon from War and Peace. He tries to write his own narrative, seize control of history. He rebels against being a part of the bouquet. That is the fatal delusion. And this is where Foucault's analysis of power becomes helpful. So Foucault's this French philosopher who lived, he died like in 1988, is surprisingly late, and is often considered to be, well, one of the great French philosophers, a philosopher of violence, a philosopher of the system, a philosopher of history, philosopher of sexuality, of expectations. He kind of follows in an arc that starts with Husserl, goes through Heidegger, Sartre, and then Foucault. Anyway, he writes this book in 1976 called The Mesh of Power. Foucault writes about the impossibility of escaping authority. This is a quote from Foucault. I think it's my translation. One power does not exist, but many powers. Powers, this means forms of domination. Get this, power is domination. This is very Tolstoy. Power, this means forms of domination, forms of subjugation that function locally. These are all local and regional forms of power, which have their own mode of functioning, their own procedure and technique. A society is not a unitary body in which only one power is exercised. Society is in reality the juxtaposition, the link, the coordination, and also the hierarchy of different powers that nevertheless remain in their specificity. Society is an archipelago of different powers. Okay, let me quickly unpack that. If you think power is the president issuing an edict and then everybody following it, Foucault would say that you've fundamentally misunderstood how power works. Power doesn't exit the mouth of an executive and cause people to obey. Instead, power is distributed, power is local. And his metaphor for this is society is an archipelago of different powers. That is to say, separate islands, but they all belong to the same chain. And so Foucault and Tolstoy sees a mesh of power in which Tolstoy's metaphor for it is a wicker basket. You can never see where power starts and where power ends, just like the reeds in a wicker basket. They're all woven together so tightly. And that's power. Power is the basket, but the basket is itself nothing but the sum of all of these reeds, the beginnings and endings of which are invisible. So it looks like there's a single reed, but deep down we know that there are many little reeds that like pose as one big reed, as one basket. Society is an archipelago of different powers. Hadji Murat, the novella, resembles a Baedeker tourist guide of domination. To your right, the rustic interior of a Chechen hut. Follow the street straight, and you see the Georgian princesses attending a fancy Russian banquet. A little beyond that, an army captain barks orders at his illiterate soldiers, and off on the horizon, you might glimpse the Tsar condemning Polish students to horrible death. Perhaps we return to Sevastopol in September. I'm sorry, Sevastopol in December. Hadji Murat thinks he is evading powers. From his mother's home to Shamil, to a Chechen Ahol, to the Russian HQ, from the Russians to the bushes where he's slaughtered, he believes he's escaping servitude. Each apparent escape route is just another room in the system, another office, another cell. I really loved the HBO series Severance. Hadji's tragedy is not that he dies needlessly in the mud. It's that he never truly left the archipelago. He unwittingly went from one island to another. He went from Shamil to the Russians to the bushes, all the time seeking somehow to escape authority. And wherever he went, all he found was authority. Again, think of this metaphor of the wicker basket. You can't find the beginning and the end of the reeds. There's just the basket, which looks like one single reed. Tolstoy offers an image of in the kingdom of God is within you that crystallizes. This is one of my favorite quotes by Tolstoy. This is it's from the kingdom of God is within you. A horse is harnessed with others to a cart and is not free not to go where the cart goes. And if it does not pull, the cart will knock it off its feet and it will still go wherever the cart goes, dragged along, unwillingly being dragged. But despite this limited freedom, the horse is still free to pull the cart or to be dragged by it. The same is true for a human being. This is what one of my friends calls the dark Tolstoy that I'm so attracted to. You get this. You're a horse, and you can choose to refuse to pull the cart. And guess what? The cart is going to be pulled forward by the other horses. It's going to run over you and probably crush you. You can refuse. You can try to disobey the system, but the system will always find you and crush you in the mud. But you're always free inside of you to decide that this is not the right thing to do. Get this? The kingdom of God is within you. It is not without you. For Tolstoy, the only decisions that matter are the ones that pertain to the inside, because the kingdom of God is within you. This is Hadji's fate. Resistance changes the manner of destruction, not the outcome. You die in the mud. To resist is not wrong, but it is already within the logic of the system. Contrast this with The Lion and the Dog, which is a super micro short. It's like 200 words. One of Tolstoy's briefest and most disquieting parables from his Azbuka, which he worked on in the 1970s while he was writing Anna Karenina. Do you know this Bud? It's the Russian word means true story. So he wrote this in a children's book. And I'll give you the plot summary, which is practically what happened. Anyway, the plot summary, the story is already a summary. A lion is in a menagerie and is given a puppy to eat. Lion's got to eat. Instead of devouring it, the lion adopts the puppy. They live together peacefully 5 years. Eventually, the puppy dies. The lion grieves, lies down next to the body of the puppy, and refuses to eat. A few days later, the lion dies. The lion, expected to perform its nature, chooses not to perform its nature. It does not devour the dog. It does not perform leonine rage. This refusal is the one true act of freedom in Tolstoy's late moral universe, the refusal to play the game. Look, there's no rebellion, no victory, no transcendence, no nothing, just stillness. Not resistance, but non-resistance. Taoist Wu Wei, or pure Christian canonicism. Hadji Murat is not heroic. He is not romantic. He is not tragic in the classic sense. He is Tolstoy's forensic case file, a spiritual corpse presented for inspection. You remember they bring Hadji Murat's head back. Maria Dmitrievna is disgusted, but everybody wants to look at it. He thought he could escape the bouquet, but by the time he is plucked, he's already wilted. He thought he could rebel, but the watch, the inevitable course of history, it's a quote from War Peace, was ticking the whole time. And then I have a bunch of notes that I was gonna riff off of at this conference, but I ran out of time. But I see that I still have quite a bit of time. It's only 23 minutes so far. So let me just say a few things. First, the concept of Wu Wei. That's a Taoist concept, and it means not doing. It's very similar to the concept in yoga of non-grasping. It's directly opposed to this notion of agency, of being able to affect a change, of what's called consequentialism in Western philosophy. And instead, it is an acceptance of the world, and quickly becomes very Buddhistic. There's also a strong connection to Buddhism in Taoism. And Tolstoy, in fact, wrote a long article in 1903. Remember, I'm a terrible historian. Wrote a long article called Nidzelania, which is the Russian translation, not doing Wu Wei. Okay, so this concept of Wu Wei for Tolstoy is the opposition of a belief in agency, like the kind of agency that Napoleon believes that he has, versus the kind of agency that Kutuzov accepts that he has, right? Kutuzov and his twin Karataev and eventually Pierre accept the fact that they're like that horse. They accept the fact that they're within a system, and instead of opposing the system, They go with the system. Um, they don't rebel. And of course, this is such a profoundly Eastern, non-Western concept. Tolstoy would say it's canonicism. It's an Orthodox concept. And emptying of itself. That's what canonicism means. Okay, so there are some spiritual practices that resonate with this concept that Tolstoy has, with this idea that Tolstoy has in Kingdom of God is within you, within Hadji Murat, within War and Peace, I would argue. And now I just want to talk a little bit about this kind of, I haven't really thought this through. Let me throw out some parallels between Jesus and the Gospels and Hadji Murat the novella. I'm going to end up overturning these things in a second, but first, I see the last scene of Hadji Murat a lot like I see the scene at Gethsemane in the Gospels. And it seems perverse to claim that there's some sort of resemblance between Hadji and Jesus. But let me list a few. First, both of them are not Caucasian, not like Tolstoy. Second, both are apostates. There's no doubt that Jesus was an apostate, and absolutely no doubt that Hadji Murat, once he went against the jihad that had been declared by Shamil, would have been considered, was obviously an apostate. He was a Muslim who went to, who cooperated with the Russians to crush the Islamic revival in the Caucasus. Both are incredibly charismatic. Both attract followers, the Chigit, who are with Hadji at the end, and obviously the apostles. Both run athwart the system in the sense that Jesus obviously ran against the system of the post-Second Temple, the Second Temple Judaism, against the Roman rule that was in place in 0 AD, when he was born. And Hadji Murat rebels against both the Russian imperial order and Shamil's jihad and Islamic revival. Both are essentially sacrificed. And I want to say, we know how it's going to end for both of them. I guess there's nothing exactly in the Gospels that warns us that Jesus is not going to end happy. He's going to end up dead on a crucifix. But I don't think anybody reading the Gospels is surprised by that. Same thing with Hadji Murat. Hadji Murat, remember, starts with the crushed thistle, the beheaded crushed thistle, called a Tatarin. Of course, he's not Tatar. He's an Avar, but let's leave that aside. They're both mountain people. There are other similarities, and I'll come up with them. But now, let's talk about that last scene of Hadji Murat as a kind of Gethsemane. So let me say, let me remind you that Gethsemane happens at the end of the Gospels. John speaks about it obliquely, but it's major in the Synoptic Gospels. And Gethsemane is the name of the garden that's outside of town, where Jesus goes after the Last Supper. As you'll remember, it goes something like, I'm Catholic, so I'm not a great Christian. Well, I don't know the Bible as well as I should maybe. So there's the Last Supper. Judas leaves early, betrays Jesus. Remember how easy it is to betray people for some silver shekels. Jesus goes and he leaves most of his apostles behind at the Last Supper, but he takes his favorite apostles, John, Mark, I can't remember who he takes, James and John, his favorites. and he leaves them too. He leaves them in the grove, and then he goes and he prays. And this is when he says, he has this moment of doubt, and he says, I see what's coming, and I don't like it. I don't want to die. Let it pass. Let me not suffer. And he keeps going back to his apostles, and they've fallen asleep, and he wakes them up, and they say, "This time we'll stay awake." And then he goes and prays, and comes back, and they're asleep. This happens 3 times, and then at the end, the Roman soldiers come, led by Judah, to the garden and arrest Jesus. And I think we know the rest of the story. I just want to say that the end of Hadji Murat strikes me as a Gethsemane presence. I'm not saying it's exact. That's not how Tolstoy works. But we have a final showdown outside of town, like Gethsemane and the Grove. It ends the same, with each of them dying, humiliated. In both cases, it's authority that comes for them. For Jesus, it's the Romans, and for Hadji Murat, it's the Russians. But there's a difference, and this is essential. And that's why I think about the end of Hadji Murat as a kind of parody of Gethsemane and the end of the Gospels. Because while Jesus submits, Hadji Murat only offers one solution, which is always violence and always rebellion. And Jesus doesn't rebel. Jesus, does what he's supposed to do. He fulfills God's law, and doesn't resist that. And so is deified, is made God. And Hadji Murat instead resists and ends up dead, bloody in the mud, with his head cut off and kicked carelessly in a burlap bag. And so, in a sense, Hadji Murat should be understood as an inversion of the Jesus in the Gospels. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. 33 minutes, and I'll write a short quiz, and I'll send the link. And if you watched the lecture, answering the questions to the quiz should be laughably easy. All right, thanks.